Hello, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 18th, 2024. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. This is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so we need to follow their code of conduct, which basically boils down to let's be nice to each other and not use bad language. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started today. I'll post the agenda in the chat. Let's add stuff if desired there. Hey, Shane. How's it going?
Oh, not bad. How you doing?
Pretty good. Okay. First things first from Surya, who is not here, but that's fine. We can still talk about it. So today in ANP, we have up to 1,000 priorities allowed as part of the API. I guess Surya was looking for feedback on what is actually being implemented today. It looks like Oven Kubernetes has a maximum of 200 today. I know when we originally did this, we kind of, chose 1,000 because it was really high, but we all kind of assumed that in reality, it would never hopefully get that high, right? And I can link everyone to the documentation. So anyone who's been implementing the API, do you have any opinions on this? Do we think we should limit the number of distinct priorities more than 1,000? Let me just, I think the validation is in here. I'll link where that actually happens. Right here. Go ahead, Sean. Sorry, I was looking at another screen.
So we don't have any hard limits on the number of policies you can apply. I would say, just given how our policy is implemented, like you don't want to have 1,000 policies on every pod. That would be excessive. I have seen customers put hundreds of policies onto certain pods. It's not a direct sort of apples to apples comparison because that's with sort of Calico policy, but
no, that's
people do put 100 or 200 policies on a pod if they have a big kind of auto-generated policy set or something like that. So it's not out of the question to hit that sort of limit. Obviously, there's some subtlety about whether you're talking about 200 different priorities or if you don't really care about, like, if you can handle 1,000 policies but only 200 priorities and your policies don't require more than 200 priorities to represent them, then you might be okay with that.
Yep. That's some good feedback. I guess, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I prefer having a bit more headroom just because it makes the administering of the policies easier. Like if you have different teams or different types of policies, you can sort of say, oh, this type of policy starts at range 100 to 200. This range is 300 to 500. But I'm sure like 200 policies is probably 200 levels is probably enough that people could do what they needed to do. But I think it's easier if you have a little bit more headroom.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess for us here, like, we don't want to, in the upstream, like, limit some implementations. Like, I think really all we want to do is provide like a reasonable upward bound. I think. Sorry, what do you think? Sorry, I just saw you hopped on. It's your item we were talking about, so.
Yeah, I don't think let's put it this way. My question didn't come from a place of limiting implementations to a specific number, even if they can probably do more. I guess it came from my understanding of the enhancement for admin network policy and the use cases behind it that, most of it is around how can I not duplicate it on every network policy in every namespace. And so I would expect a handful at the least. And so I'm really unhappy I joined late because I didn't hear Sean complete what he was talking about with his experience in Calico. So do you guys have your global network policies being created a lot in large number in your clusters?
We don't have any hard limits on the number of policies you can make, because we render policies generally into kind of some sort of linear sequenced thing, be it IP tables or what have you. My feeling is that having 200 as a sort of limit is a little bit low, because I have seen customers create hundreds of policies in Calico's policy model, and usually it's because the security team has some policy auto generation where they put a lot of policies in that are from some central store, some kind of use case like that, where they want to generate a bunch of baseline policies for their own reasons. So I have seen like more than a couple of hundred policies being generated. I feel like 1,000 kind of gives you that bit of headroom above that, so you can then organize, you can subdivide your range into different groups and teams and things. And so my instinct is that 1,000 does have a bit of value rather than 200. But I think most people could live with 200 if it was there, but I think having the extra headroom is good.
Yeah, I think that's also great feedback to have, because maybe you do make a point in terms of how people reserve ranges and priorities, and they want to leave gaps, and you probably want, okay, I reserve 0 to 100, the other team takes 700 to 800, whatever, so there's no overlap whatsoever. So that is something I didn't think of. So cool. I think then maybe before we go to beta, we stick with 1,000, right? So we don't make changes there. I mean, for me, it's not a big problem. We have that hard limitation in the implementation, so we're just going to have to get around it by, let's say, documenting it. And maybe that means we are not conformant with the upstream API, which it is what it is.
No, I don't think we want to make it that 1,000 explicit priorities have to be like what it takes to quote unquote be conformant with the API. I think we should have a maybe a test that ensures, well, it's kind of encoded in the API, right? You can't make more than 1,000 distinct priorities, right?
Yeah,
I think that's kind of the main thing. I don't think it means you're not conformant, because it's unrealistic to add a constraint like that in the upstream.
got it. Yeah. So Dan had raised this in my downstream documentation, right? Like he said, like if that's a hard limit, you need to add conformance tests for the higher priority range, and then also the fact that OVNK fails on that. So that is where this came from, the conversation, right? So but this is at least good to know, and if it's useful for the community, let's just do that, keep it that way, and we can see how to hack it up downstream.
Sean, did you raise your hand again?
Just going to say you could split the you could have like 1,000 different levels of priority, but have a separate thing that says and CNIs must implement at least 200, must support at least 200 of these different levels or something. Maybe it's a little bit awkward putting that in the spec, but
yeah, no, that's a good question. We could implement a minimum. I think for now it's all right. In my definition, Surya, like we don't have a conformance test today that tests for this number of explicit priorities, right? So we're saying whatever passes our conformance tests as they exist today is a conformant implementation, right?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. So that works for me. Cool.
If there's confusion about that, it probably means we need to document it somewhere.
I guess what's not happened, Andrew, is the fact that nobody has vetted that these are the finite set of tests that you have to pass, right? Like, so I guess it's me and maybe Yang contributed to some of the tests on named ports, but maybe we also need that reviewed, right? Like, is this like is this sort of tests we have today considered conformant? Are we missing something in that suit, or are there gaps, or are they too much, right? Like maybe some things don't make sense. So maybe that is one thing that we haven't done so far, which probably begs the question. So I think it came from a point on, oh, there is a missing conformance test, right? Like, so I guess that's where we probably need to work on a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think as we get more implementations, hopefully we'll get some feedback from them as well. Like, oh, this doesn't make any sense for us. That's the only way they're going to get better. Like, we can read them over and over again, but there's going to be holes that we might not notice. Okay, anything else on that from anyone? Sweet. Okay, so moving right along, Nate, bringing back up the dry run issue that Nadia, who is on PTO and is not here, opened, and if that violates SIG network charter or not. And this also, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I just want to make sure it's very narrow. I don't want to debate anything else about it. I just want us to get clarification on that point. So we don't have to go into the actual proposal itself, but I am curious.
For sure. So let me, first of all,
What violates what?
Well, Nate was talking about, we had talked about this a bit. First of all, like, we don't have a dedicated SIG network policy API charter, right? So we're referring back to the SIG network charter. I don't think Gateway API has like a defined charter in Git somewhere either, unless I'm mistaken, Shane.
I believe you're right. Somebody can always find these things when I try to say confidently they're not there, but I believe you're right.
And so I'll toss it back over to you, Nate, about where, so this, for past history on this, right? This is a request that Nadia opened for adding like a dry run mode. Nothing had been decided on it. It had just been an open issue. And Nate, you're saying that it violates the SIG network charter in what way?
So the dry run mode, I don't think we have to mention one implementation detail.
Yeah.
Which is that the dry run mode requires some sort of feedback mechanism from the CNI, right? It says logging, but just to steelman the argument, it could be anything. I think this is the first API that would require something like that for the CNI to have a particular output. I think it's then technically specifying CNI behavior. We can specify the inputs via the API, but then specifying the outputs is, I think, proposing CNI changes. And so
that's kind of what it sounds like, yeah.
I think I don't think there's an example of any other MPEP or API change that has required a direct output change in the CNI. If that's the case, then I do think that this proposal inherently violates the charter, because modifying the CNI is actually out of scope, not just for the network SIG, but actually for the K8s community as a whole. It's not inside the Kubernetes project.
Yeah, have you run this by like Mike Brown or somebody over that does stuff in the CNI world? Just out of curiosity.
I haven't, because my argument is that it is violating. Like I would prefer, I don't think that this is an implementable proposal precisely because it there's no way around requiring the CNI to do something in response to generate output.
Yeah, I get the logic of it. I think maybe Mike might have good thoughts.
Right.
Mike might have some insights or some ideas about what to do instead, that kind of thing.
Sure. My argument would be that I think that the proposal itself, this is symptomatic of the deeper flaw that it's trying to do too much, and that we should just say something like this is probably unimplementable. I don't think that there's a way around this. What is the point of a dry run mode if there's no feedback mechanism? And there's only one way to get, I think that if you can say there's no way for us to get feedback, then you're saying that, well, that if there's no way to get feedback, then it is an unimplementable feature.
Remind me which one this, it sounds like I have some studying to do. Remind me which one this is.
This is
Yeah, I'll
now-
link.
It's in the notes too here. Okay, so Mike Brown, I will hit him up, but I believe
I mean, it'd be just worth having. He's very communicative. It'd be worth just even talking to him for a
Sure.
second. Just being like, hey, this is something. What do you think? He'll have an
Sure.
opinion.
So I aside from even the issue, like I just want to understand this for if we run into similar situation moving forward. And just for everyone here, like I think after our talk last time on this issue, the general consensus was like, yeah, we were essentially leaning away from it. Like we kind of agreed, like trying to force people to do this in upstream may not be the right place. That's what I felt like I came away with it. So I'm trying to leave this issue out of the door. What I'm trying to understand is like, if we go down sort of the charter light route, like where I want to be really explicit about where we draw the line. So like using this one as an example, coming off what I just said, like whatever happens with it, happens with it. This would have required adding a dry run equals true or false field to the API, right? And then implementations would have to support it or not, right? So can you just help me understand like where that line is of breaking a charter, of like enforcing that an implementation provide output versus just being able to implement a feature of the API or not? I was just unclear there.
Yeah, I think that there is a good logical distinction between those two things versus this internal black box needs to meet this expected behavior in conforming with the API versus this API modifies behavior. Well, it doesn't actually, in theory, it's not supposed to modify behavior, which is interesting, but then it's supposed to log a specific output or give a specific output somewhere else that is unspecified.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you there. And I think we can codify it so that if we ever run into a similar situation, like it's super clear and cut, right? And so maybe it makes sense for us to either add an explicit addendum to the SIG network charter or have and you and I had talked about this, have our own charter that lives somewhere for the network policy API. I'm totally up to that. I just want to make sure it's like written down so that we don't
For sure.
ever run into it again.
I think it would be instructive to know.
Yeah, 100%. And Mike, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm a little confused about like where this boundary is as far as like violating the charter. Because like to me, I'm coming from the context of Gateway API, and there are like many things where an input is required to have a specific output of some sort, like updating a status field or things like that. It is the concern here specifically that like this is it feels more of like it's a concern similar to like the issue with enums, where it's a breaking change to add a new type that is not supported if the existing behavior assumes that like it's only like one of these three options or something like that. That feels more like the case here, is that it would be a breaking change to have a new field that an implementation that specifies behavior that an implementation may not know what to do with. And that feels like the issue, not that it's like a charter thing.
That's kind of what I was saying too. I was a bit confused there. I think the main thing like that it reaches all the way back to is like we as an upstream group don't want to implement a feature necessarily that can't be supported by a major downstream consumer, right? Like it's not going to be right for us as an upstream API. Maybe 3 CNIs can support it and 1 can't, and we're just going to steamroll that last CNI. Like that's not what I want to do. Like I want to make sure we don't do that, right? Like, so I think that's the larger concern, right, Nate, or is something along those lines.
Because I'm coming this from the perspective of like, I'm very interested in doing something very similar to like a dry run or audit mode in like auth policy for potentially Gateway API. So like this, it feels like something where like the problem is one, that it would be a breaking change to existing implementations, and 2, that it sounds like it's proposed to be structured as like required capability core, rather than something of like a policy type dry run or something like that, or like policy type enforced, or like it's a breaking change, and it's not possible for some implementations to not support it. Like it feels like it's a thing that it should be possible for a conformant implementation to not support.
So I've been studying myself up here and reading things over, and so far what Mike is saying is resonating with me, that the issue of breaking the scope. I kind of see it, but I definitely see what Mike's saying about you're kind of breaking the implementations potentially.
There is
Like
this element of the feature where it is an API that once supported, if your feature doesn't support it, it will break the expected behavior that the user has, right? It's not implementing is breaking behavior.
I mean, in Gateway API, we have tons of that kind of stuff of like, that's why we have the whole extended conformance, is there's a whole slew of options that you can set on a route, and if the implementation doesn't support it, it will just tell you in status it doesn't support this.
I will not argue with the fact that there are other good arguments for why this feature in particular probably shouldn't go forward. I am really curious to get to the bottom of this deeper question, though, around like, where does this SIG's mandate end in saying what the CNI has to do in order to conform? A status field in a CRD, I think, is a very different thing than a distributed logging system that goes back to the API server that every CNI now has to use.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you there, and I think that it is totally reasonable for like any kind of logging output to be implementation specific, and really like the dry run capability is just saying like, if this field is set and the implementation supports it, then do not enforce the policy.
Right, but some people might not even get there. They might not even get to the point of if dry run is, they might ignore dry run completely and actually enforce the policy.
Yeah, so I think that's a problem, and producing it as a breaking change creates that problem. If you, I think that if you want to introduce something like this, it probably requires like an API revision, like a V1 Alpha 2, like that, and structuring it as understanding this field, and either I support it or I don't, but yeah.
We shouldn't get too far into this because Nadia isn't here to defend it, and there might be various arguments.
Yeah, I was about to see if we could rein it in a little bit. I definitely subscribe to it, and I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, I am really just curious about this narrow question of like, where is this line? Because I think it actually is a good thing for us to understand going forward.
I agree with you. I 100% agree with you. And I think the thing to think about is it's not necessarily a line of API design, but it's a little more blurry than that. It's a line of API design and how we design conformance, and how do we classify as conformance in the upstream sense, right? Existing conformance has just been your implementation passes this suite of tests, you get a badge, yay, you're conformant. Maybe that needs to be further defined. I'm not sure. So, but you're right. Let's let Nadia kind of chime in more. I think I'm just trying to think of the best way to follow up this. We can continue next meeting talking about it. The issue is a good place for it. Maybe we need a new issue to define this larger problem that's less connected to the feature that we're talking about. That might help.
Very interesting. Thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate you
Yeah.
kind of raising it.
As a general point, like I think if we all agreed, if we all had implementations and they were all like different, but we all agreed it was a good thing, I could see us having fields in the network policy defined APIs that assist other features that our platforms have. But if we can't agree on what they should be, then that's a much harder sell.
Right. Yeah. And we need some democratic way of dealing with that at the end of the day, right? Like there's different factors too. Like obviously, like everyone here has been super involved in this now for a good bit. So like everyone's voice really matters. But if you get someone coming in to a meeting for the first time, which hasn't happened, like, and saying, no, you can't do this because we can't do this, like, and they haven't been involved ever, like that's a different story. So I don't know the best way to codify it, but I would like to. That's my opinion. So I'm gonna think about it some more. And then this is also like a SIG network. This isn't just a problem we're going to be facing. So Shane being here is very helpful because I think he'll come up with some stuff as well.
If it comes down to it, this will be something I can help with. So
amazing, sweet. Thank you, Nate. Yeah, I appreciate it. Good conversation. As a follow up, I think if we can open up an issue to describe this, what we talked about today, I think that'd be good. We can at least continue.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt to just check in with Mike Brown. And if you want to if you do that via PM and you feel so inclined, do feel free to add me to that conversation. But you don't have to either.
He's on the Kubernetes Slack?
I'm almost positive. Maybe I only talked to him on the CNCF Slack. I'm not actually sure now. You're making me second guess myself. I thought he was. Yeah, he's here. Just gotta text his hat. Nope, that's not him. Never mind. He is in Texas. Well, anyway, we can find him through GitHub or something. We can do that async. What's next?
Sorry, I was just typing a note in the agenda. So next is an agenda item I put on here, kind of two just maintenance and housekeeping things. The first one is obviously the FQDN PEP has merged, and now Rahul thankfully opened a PR actually implementing what was agreed on in the NPEP. So it shouldn't be that hard to get in, and it's pretty short. I reviewed it today. If anyone else wants to review it, please do so. Once that merges, I am going to cut a new release. I already opened the draft PR for the API review. So essentially the way it'll work is this PR I've linked here will show the diff of only the API from, sorry, Rahul, before I hop into that, go ahead. I didn't see your hand raised.
Oh, no worries. I actually had a question about the FQDN API thing. We can talk about that afterwards. I didn't put something on the agenda, so whichever is better for.
Let's talk about it now. Mine was really short.
Okay, I think the only question I had was currently our or spec or the CAP at least, it says that we only implement FQDN selectors in the standard admin network policy. We said we're not going to implement in base admin network policy. Because then it is hard to override it using the namespace network policies. That's sort of the rationale we went with. And we said maybe once we get network policy v2, we can bring it into base, but for now it's just regular admin. The question I have is, right now the API objects are all shared between base and admin network policies. So if you add the selector to regular admin network policy, it shows up in base admin network policy. Do we want to do this through, I don't know if cell validation is strong enough to catch that and do that, or should we be forking the API types? I know that gets a little bit messy, but maybe that's the best way to do it.
So Surya had to drop My first gut check is fork the API types. I don't think it's going to be that messy. It might result in some code duplication, but I think in general, from what I've seen in Kubernetes APIs, like that happens. Trying to use cell to like make a trick to not allow users to use a specific type field seems gross to me, and results in like not a strongly typed object in some ways.
Yeah.
That's just my gut check, but I would like, Surya had to drop. I would really like her opinion on it just because she's the one who implemented that type. So that's where I'm at. I think dedicated types is the right way forward.
Sounds good. Anyone else have any thoughts? I will ping Surya on Slack or something and get her feedback.
I agree with Andrew. I think fork the types. That'd be a lot cleaner.
Sorry, I was driving. I hope nobody is raising their hands yet. But yeah, I mean, on the Entrail perspective, from the Entrail perspective, I think I'm all for splitting up the type for baseline and admin if it comes to that way. But the other thing I also wanted to bring up is that we probably also wanted to consider by bumping the minor API version when we actually do that, right? The reason why I'm bringing this up is that I figured that from the latest quote-unquote release version, which is 0.11, to what we have right now, which is tagged at 15, we actually had some breaking changes in the API types. For example, in the subject or the ingress peers, if we are coming down to namespace the pods, it used to be that we have 2 levels of nestedness. Now it's only 1. And it's actually a breaking change if you think about it, because implementations needs to adapt to these API types and change their implementations to understand the API. And having all these types only tagged with different versions in let's say 0.11 versus 0.15, it's probably not good enough if all the APIs are actually V1 Alpha 1, because downloading different versions of the manifest would actually mean that you download different versions of the API, even though they're all V1 Alpha 1. And it's really hard for implementations to debug now, right? So let's say Entrail, we say that we support V1 Alpha 1 version of the API. Now we don't even know which API version we're talking about, because if we support one of them, then the other won't be supported because they're actually breaking. So
that's a good point. I'm fully about it.
So my suggestion is that if we are to think about type changes like that, we probably needed to think about upgrading the API version as well, at least to V1 Alpha 2.
Yeah, I'm a full +1. I think we have a big enough suite of new features in this to warrant bumping to V1 Alpha 2. And I like that feedback. If there's no objections, that's how I'll progress with the new release. Thanks for bringing that up, Rahul, or Yang, sorry. And Rahul, thanks for working on this. We appreciate it. So yeah, coming out of that conversation, I had opened a V016 API review PR just as like a temp, showing folks what we're going to end up doing. I'll change that to a V020 API review PR. And once Rahul's changes merge, I'll go ahead and mark that as ready for review. The way it works is that PR is never going to merge. It's solely for review purposes. It solely is just so that SIG network approvers can come in and take a look at what we've done between our V01.1 release and our new V020 release, give that the approval, and then we can use that PR link, which will be closed, as the API approved annotation. So that just allows us to be an official K8s.io object that's endorsed by SIG network. But yeah, sounds good. I totally hear you, Yang. makes sense to me. And having another official release will come as I know a lot of downstream consumers are been waiting on it, so it'll make our lives a lot easier.
Does Kubernetes have a sort of official way to label the working branch, like so that you can have a kind of v1 alpha next or something, rather than having an explicit version in there that gets confusing if someone takes a copy of the CRD from master at some point, or is it main in that repo, takes it from main.
Yeah.
And then it has a version in it, but it doesn't actually reflect the version that we as a group tagged as that version later.
That's an excellent question. And no, there is no mechanism. I don't believe so as of today. Like, we're following in the footsteps of Gateway API, and I think their closest mechanism was the concept of standard versus experimental features. They don't have a way to consume, or the concept of channels. They don't have a way to easily consume like main, I don't think.
Yeah, there's nothing like,
Yeah,
if you're installing the CRDs from the main branch and they happen to change during the course of development, that's kind of on you for installing them from the main branch. It's yeah, that's why we definitely recommend installing from release branches. Like, yeah, this is something that I would love if API Machinery had a stronger convention or way to solve this, and also for like provisional changes to things without getting locked into it. Now is breaking if you change anything, but yeah, I'm not aware of any mechanism that's better for this.
but Sean, if there is a use case, like we are in full control of it. Like, if we need to cut a release with V1 Alpha 2 and then have it a PR immediately afterwards that puts main at V1 Alpha 2 next, or some weird tag to ensure that people don't do that, we could have that discussion. Like, I think that'd be kind of cool, to be honest with you, because it is super confusing for folks. Like, you go look at main and everything says V1 Alpha 2, but then you have a release that has V1 Alpha 2.
I think from an implementer's point of view, I'd kind of prefer if main had at least had the next version that we're going to release in there, and then I can keep pulling the main one, and then eventually it's cut as a release, and I pull in the release version of it into my implementation. But obviously, once I want to do my releases based on like an actual tag. I don't want to do it on the version that was on main. But I want to be kind of tracking the thing we're working towards. That would be my instinct if there's not a good syntax for a dev release. I think in Calico we do nightly releases that kind of count up using the Semver convention, but I don't know if that would work well for an API.
That's what I was gonna say. That's the problem with like Kubernetes APIs, is that like, if you're intending to do a V1 Alpha 2 as you're iterating on it and making breaking changes while it's still in alpha, then like that's reasonable. But you have the like bundle version of like the 0.11 or whatever it's at, and then you also have like the V1 alpha version, and then like once you get to V1, then just like even the next like version 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, it's still on V1. Because you're probably not, even you're making additive changes at that point. You're not making breaking changes, but they're probably not going into a V2. They're probably just going into the like 1.3 version of the V1.
Yeah, it's unique. I feel like it's a unique problem compared to how most software is versioned and released, right? Like, we have
the Kubernetes versioning model makes this a real pain.
Yeah. And I linked the documentation we have today, Sean, for versioning. Like, I am happy to addend that and make changes based on what makes sense, right? Like, because I think we can make the bundle version work how you want. I'm struggling to understand how we would make the API version necessarily work, right? Because I don't want to have like V1 Alpha 3 or Beta 1 checked into main, because then I think based on everyone, the way it's been done so long, like everyone will come and look at it, get confused, be like, well, where's beta? Like, why is it checked in this file and typed? And then maybe that's just a problem with convention.
Yeah, thorny problem.
Thorny problem for sure. It took me a long time just to understand how gateway APIs, like the subtle differences between bundle version, API version, and channels worked. So not fun.
And
No
we
one
also
told you
haven't
that
solved
it's hard.
either. We're still trying to figure out if there's a better way that we can manage this. Like, it's a real problem, and we haven't
Yeah.
solved it either.
Step 1, battle to write an API in a cohesive manner. Step 2, battle to create the right release infrastructure to support it. It never ends. Okay. Cool. Thanks for bringing that up, though. If it becomes like a blocker ever, my first answer would be, Sean, like, ping us and let's cut a release. And then that can be a good intermediary
This is my
step.
first exposure to bundle versions. I think I'm a bit of a noob, but it sounds like the bundle version is like the experimental version clocking up as we revise things, and then
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Once people start shipping products, like we need a proper Kubernetes version on there, right? Otherwise it's going to get very confusing.
Agreed. And I need help in defining that. So like maybe we can do it via an issue and try to build consensus on it. Or just in a PR. I can't do it all myself on that one. So I'll need everyone's opinions. Because I am not a release engineer. I just follow what Gateway API does. Yay, Shane and Mike. Okay, y'all. Anything else for today? Got 13 minutes left, so feel free to bring things up if needed. Going once, going twice. Sold. We'll give everyone 13 minutes back today. Thanks so much for coming. I thought that was a productive meeting, and yeah, hopefully next time we have a official new release, we can celebrate that. So thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.
Right.